This is to introduce our new book with Oxford University Press, just out in America and in Europe, titled A Liberal Actor in a Realist World, the EU Regulatory State and the Global Political Economy of Energy.
We've written this book as part of a large European Union-funded FP7 research project called GREEN, which stands for Global Reordering Evolution Through Networks.
The book essentially starts off with a very simple but important observation, which is the energy world out there is changing. It's changing on a lot of fronts. We see new actors rising on that stage, new demand centers emerging. That's China, that's India. We see old actors coming with new agendas. And we see actors that essentially have been around for a while and remain important energy consumers, such as the European Union and the US. And this is exactly where the question of the book starts. What is an actor, such as the European Union, doing in a world that becomes a little bit more securitized when it comes to energy supplies?
We make two assertions, which in a way are assumptions in this book. One is that the world of energy has become more realist in the sense that it's more driven by geopolitics, it's more driven by concerns of security, it's more driven by issues of security of supply, and less shaped by rules, international trade, and stable institutions. The other assertion that we make is that the EU is principally a liberal actor. That means that the European Union is an organization which has as its grand strategy, it's thinking about what kind of an organization it is and what kind of goals it wants to achieve, a rather liberal outlook, by which we mean it is free trade oriented, and there is a general assumption built into the EU system that a lot of international problems and regional problems are best solved by approaching them in terms of trade. The EU's liberal grand strategy informs much of its thinking about energy policy. And energy policy for the EU is a question of how we deal with oil, how we deal with gas, and how we deal with the climate challenge.
You have important dynamics going on the international stage. You have a shale gas revolution in the US that changes international gas markets. You have the climate change challenge, essentially the question of whether or not we're going to burn the planet by using hydrocarbons to fire our energy systems. And all of that gives you a situation where an actor, such as the European Union, has to come up with policy answers.
If we argue that the EU is a liberal actor, what does that mean in terms of energy policy? It means that it approaches the challenges it faces as if they were market problems, and it tries to solve them with the tools of a regulatory state. An example of this would be Gazprom, a large state-owned company that some analysts say is just an arm of the Russian government, and others say is just another international fossil fuel company. We argue that whatever the truth of that, the European Union approaches it as a large, dominant supplier of gas, not primarily as a political problem, but primarily as a market problem. We find that this kind of liberal strategy that the European Union uses works better when it's targeted at firms like Gazprom than when it's targeted at governments like the Russian government. The reason is that the governments that from the European Union's perspective are somewhat awkward or difficult partners in trade are so very often because they don't buy into the liberal trade-oriented values of the European Union. Companies, on the other hand, who want to sell their goods on the European market or establish subsidiaries in the European market do have to conform with these rules, even if they don't like them.
I think there's one element that is very important to keep in mind in that entire story, which is the element of attractiveness. The idea here is really that because the EU is such an interesting market and such an important market for a lot of players and such a significant import market, and because it is high priced, it is a market where a lot of players want to play. So what the EU as a regulatory state says, we are open, we'll give you access, you can come and play on our market, but you have to play according to our market rules. We in the book start arguing that the attractiveness exerted by the European Union, which is an element of soft power, acquires a hard edge, because the access to the market is somewhat made on a conditional basis. And the condition is play according to our rules. And if you don't do that, we, as the European Commission, come along and hit you over the head with a big regulatory stick and make sure that you apply with the frameworks that we have put in place. Now, let's go back to the question of whether all of that works. Well, you can argue it does, because whilst Gazprom and Moscow, for instance, the Kremlin, try to play a very geopolitical game, the European Commission has effectively said, look, we don't exactly buy into that game, but what we understand is that we can make you change your business model. And that's exactly what Gazprom had to do. Another element of the effectiveness of that approach is with a view, comes into play with a view to how the EU actually also exports its rules. It doesn't necessarily only say, look, you come and play according to our rules in our market, which you can or cannot do. What it also does is it proactively exports its regulation. It does so, for instance, by supporting the Energy Community, which is a little organization based in Vienna.
There is, of course, a long-standing debate out there, both amongst policymakers and in the literature, as to what kind of power the EU is on the international stage and what kind of power the EU should be on the international stage. On one side, we have what might be labelled the normative power Europe stance. The idea that the EU can, does and should influence the rest of the world by setting a good example and, if you like, exporting its norms. On the other hand, we have politicians, academics, practitioners in the energy industry who argue that the EU needs to become a more muscular economic power. Based on the research we're setting out in this book, we argue that the EU is, by and large, a regulatory power. Its scope is more narrow than those who focus on either normative or economic power might suggest. But within a relatively narrow scope, the EU does have a clear representative, the European Commission. It does have a strong toolbox, its regulatory power toolbox, and this does work quite well on a number of specific issues. To the extent that we have a normative message here, it's not only that the European Union is a regulatory power, but that this is what it ought to be. The EU's best way of dealing with a wide variety of challenges, whether it's volatile oil prices, climate change, or questions of security of supply in the gas sector, is to treat these issues as market failures and to use the tools that it has in its regular toolbox to deal with them. This is not just pragmatic, it's